Hello and welcome, I'm Thomas Porteous and you're watching NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top stories. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Kiev will not accept any Russian proposal to surrender the Donbas region in exchange for a ceasefire, warning it could be used for future attacks. His remarks come ahead of Friday's Trump-Putin meeting in Alaska, where territory swaps are expected to be discussed. Small groups of Russian soldiers advanced near Dobropilya in one of the biggest incursions this year, part of Moscow's drive to seize all of the Donetsk region. Ukraine dispatches reserve forces, describing heavy fighting ahead of the Alaskan summit. Israeli air and drone strikes pound Gaza City's Zetawin and Sabra districts for a third day, causing widespread destruction, Hamas officials say, as Israel prepares to occupy the city. Meanwhile, the UK, EU, Australia, Canada and Japan warn famine is unfolding and demand immediate steps to allow aid into the enclave. China's military says it monitored and drove away a US destroyer after it entered waters near the disputed Scarborough Shoal without approval. Beijing claims almost all the entire South China Sea, despite overstepping claims from several Southeast Asian nations. The US has not yet responded. National Guard troops and armoured vehicles appear across Washington, D.C. a day after President Trump took control of the city's police force. The capital's mayor calls the move an authoritarian push, as 800 Guard troops and 500 federal agents are expected to be deployed. The State Department's annual rights report, shortened under President Trump, alleges deteriorating human rights in Britain, France and Germany. It notes no issues in El Salvador, despite reports from deportees of beatings and sleep deprivation in prison. The Congolese army says Rwanda-backed M23 rebels have launched multiple attacks on its positions in eastern DR Congo, despite a ceasefire deal. Several days of fighting have been reported in the region, reviving tensions between Kinshasa and Kigali. France, Germany and the UK tell the UN they are ready to reimpose snapback sanctions on Iran if it does not return to nuclear talks. The foreign ministers of the E3 issued the warning in a letter urging Tehran to re-engage with the international community. Now we start in Europe with the continent's defining conflict, the Russia-Ukraine war. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says small Russian infantry troops had advanced up to 10 kilometers in several areas on the Eastern Front near the Dnipropetrovsk and Kramatorsk region. He says the push is timed to coincide with the Trump-Putin talks. Ukrainian forces have liberated 6 of 18 occupied settlements in the Sumy region. Russia is shifting troops from Sumy to the Pokrovsk and Zaporozhye for a new assault in early September. Zelensky insists territorial issues be discussed only after a ceasefire and with security guarantees. He also rejects calls to pull out of Donbas, warning it could expose Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhia and Kharkiv to attack. We're now joined by Andrew Latham, who is a professor of international relations. He joins us live from Minnesota. Andrew, pleasure to talk to you as always on the program. How significant is the timing of Russia's latest advancements in relation to this upcoming summit between President Trump and President Putin in Alaska?
Well, I think we would be hard-pressed to see it as coincidence. I think these advances, these attacks have been in preparation for quite some time. You don't just launch these on a whim. So the Russians have been working on this for a while, but they're making breakthroughs, which we haven't seen for a long time in this conflict. The Ukrainians, of course, are downplaying this, as are their friends and allies in Western Europe. But many other very credible observers of military affairs are saying that these are serious breakthroughs They have yet to be consolidated, but serious breakthroughs, which are likely to have an impact on the course of discussion in Alaska between the U.S. and Russian presidents.
Yes, indeed, Andrew. And what does Russia's focus on shifting troops from Sumy to Pokrovsk and Zaporozhye tell us about the short-term strategy in Russia's military ambitions?
Well, there are only so many troops to go around. The Ukrainians are finding this out, and the Russians are as well. If you're going to double down in one sector, you have to draw the troops from somewhere else, and I think that's all that's going on here. But of course, the other side can take advantage of that as well, which is what the Ukrainians are doing, and now that the Russians have moved troops out of the Sumy region. So not surprising, but if we look at this in the aggregate, we see that the Russians are making much more strategically, operationally important breakthroughs around Petrovsk, for example, which again is going to, I think, change the balance of forces, the balance of power, as it were, on the battlefield. And that's going to have knock-on effects in terms of the way in which the Russian and American presidents interact in Alaska, but also the way the Europeans and President Zelensky are sort of positioning themselves in this diplomatic context.
Andrew, thank you for that insight. You are staying with us to discuss further developments. The White House has confirmed that the Trump-Putin meeting will be one-on-one in Alaska and has hinted that there may be plans for Trump to travel to Russia in the future. White House spokesperson Caroline Leavitt said the summit is meant for the president to have a better understanding on how to end the conflict. Let's listen in to her statements.
On Friday morning, President Trump will travel across the country to Anchorage, Alaska, for a bilateral meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. I think this conversation on Friday is focused on ending the war in Ukraine as far as the president's perspective goes. Those conversations, I think the president is interested in having, but his main priority right now is ending this war and to stop the killing that has gone on for far too long.
Ahead of the meeting, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio spoke to Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov with the State Department, saying both sides confirmed their intention to hold successful talks in Alaska. Trump will also participate in talks with Ukraine virtually on Wednesday, joining President Volodymyr Zelensky, European leaders and NATO officials just 2 days before he sits down with Putin. We are once again joined by Andrew Latham. Andrew, this summit on Friday certainly is going to be grand. There's going to be a huge media presence. We're sure that the two most powerful men in the world are going to make this a spectacle. However, what message does this one-on-one meeting send to both allies and adversaries alike?
Well, I think, first of all, it's important to note that peace in Ukraine is only a secondary agenda item here. The most important agenda item for both the U.S. and Russia is to repair their relationships. The United States wants a better relationship. President Trump certainly wants a better relationship with Russia, partly in the hope of driving a wedge between Russia and China in this kind of multipolar world of great power competition, a reverse Kissinger in 1972, if you like. And the Russians simply want better relations because they want out from under American sanctions pretty desperately. And so I think the main focus of the conversation in Alaska and beforehand will be on improving Russian-American relations. Now, one of the elements of improving that relationship from the American perspective is bringing some kind of peace to Ukraine. But here, this is interesting, is that these two leaders, these two great powers, are negotiating over the head of Zelensky and his government and the Ukrainian people in a way that has got President Zelensky's backup, understandably, but also has mobilized many of Ukraine's friends and partners in Western Europe. Who are making the argument that no deal can be done unless President Zelensky is at the table. So we've got some cross-cutting incentives here and some cross-cutting dynamics. I'm not sure how this summit is going to end. I rather suspect not favorably for anybody.
Yes, and Andrew, the White House has said that its aim is to better understand how to end the conflict. Is that a sign of openness or a lack of clear U.S. strategy going into negotiations?
I think the U.S. going into negotiation will settle for just about anything that will bring the bloodshed to an end. And if that means supporting, in a limited way, but supporting President Putin's demands for territory in Donbass, then I think the United States will. And certainly, I mean, if you look at the Russian constitution, Donbass is claimed as an integral part of the Russian Federation. If you look at the Ukrainian constitution, it's claimed as a fundamental part of Ukraine. And those two claims are irreconcilable. So it's not clear to me at this point how President Trump is going to square the circle. But if anybody can do it, at least at the level of optics and spectacle, as you put it, I think it's probably President Trump.
Andrew Latham, thank you very much for joining us here on the programme. Pleasure to get your insight. We now move on and over to the Middle East, where the United States has declined to criticise Israel over the killing of 5 Al Jazeera journalists in Gaza. Washington referred questions to its ally, Israel. The Israeli military claimed that Anas al-Sharif, a well-known journalist, led a Hamas terror cell involved in rocket attacks. The US State Department expressed respect for journalists, but warned Hamas members often hide within civilian groups, including posing as reporters. Listen in to what the State Department spokeswoman, Tammy Bruce, has said.
I will tell you is that we refer you to Israel for information regarding al-Sharif. Israel has released evidence that Sharif was part of Hamas and was supportive of the Hamas attack on October 7th. They're the ones who have the evidence. They're the ones who can be reached. Again, as we're dealing with a complicated, horrible situation, is that Hamas historically has had members who are embedded in society, including posing as journalists. It is a horrible thing to do for those of you who are committed to finding information for people, to be in that situation. It's horrible in any war.
Meanwhile, Egypt says it is working closely with Qatar and the United States to secure a 60-day ceasefire in Gaza. The goal is to halt the ongoing conflict and allow the flow of humanitarian aid without restrictions. Israeli air and drone strikes have hit Gaza City's Zetawin and Sabra districts for a third day, causing major destruction. Hamas says Israel is preparing to occupy the city. The UK, EU, Australia, Canada and Japan have warned that famine is unfolding and demand aid access. The WHO also urges Israel to allow medical supplies into hospitals amid a worsening health crisis. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said that Israel would let Palestinians leave the Gaza Strip as the military prepares a broader offensive in the territory. Listen in to what Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said.
תן להם את האפשרות לצאת, קודם כל לצאת מאזורי לחימה, ובכלל לצאת מהרצועה, אם הם רוצים. אנחנו נאפשר את זה, קודם כל בתוך עזה, בזמן הלחימה, ובוודאי נאפשר להם גם לצאת מעזה.
We're now joined by Professor Rohan Gunaratne. He's an international affairs expert and he joins us live from Singapore. Professor Gunaratne, always a pleasure to talk to you. Let's start off with this killing, these statements that have come from the killing of 6 journalists in the Gaza Strip, one of which, al-Sharif, was known for his widespread coverage internationally on Al Jazeera. We saw the United States, Israel's closest ally, to deny, to condemn this killing. What does Washington's decision not to directly criticize Israel, like many other countries have, signal about its priorities in this conflict?
Washington has reviewed the Israeli information and intelligence about al-Sharif. Al-Sharif was a member of Hamas. I myself reviewed the information that has now been made public, that he was a member of Hamas who infiltrated the media. And al-Sharif himself supported the attack that took place October 2023. And al-Sharif is listed as a Hamas member on the Hamas documents that Israel has recovered. That is the reason the United States has not condemned the killing of al-Sharif. So it is so important for the global media to look at this information and to dispassionately present that information, because media organizations should never be infiltrated by terrorist groups. And this has happened consistently over many years. So I don't think there will be any sympathy for al-Sharif being eliminated by the IDF. I cannot comment on the other journalists who were with al-Sharif who were killed, but with regard to al-Sharif, I'm convinced that he was a member of Hamas.
Yes, Professor Rohan Gunaratne. Obviously, that is disputed. These are claims from Israel, where many countries have come out and still condemned Israel's statements here. They have not been able to be verified by Reuters or any other news organization. However, what precedent does this set for the safety of journalists working in the Gaza Strip? This is the deadliest war in history when it comes to media workers. What are your thoughts on now the fact that Israel has said it is going to now let international journalists in to the Gaza Strip, not free from IDF supervision, may I add? What are your thoughts on that, Professor Gunaratne?
I personally believe that the Gaza war has killed nearly 200 journalists, and it's a major concern. And I think that IDF is moving in the right direction by permitting international journalists, because a lot of information about the war is distorted. For example, the images of starving children presented by Hamas and by Palestinian media, they pertain to some children who have had various diseases. It is not malnutrition. So I think that it's a very good decision on the part of Israel to permit international journalists to cover the war, because the next phase of war, to disarm Hamas, to dismantle Hamas, and to seek the release of the hostages will be a very intense one. And I think that it is the right decision Israel has made. Journalists should be protected, journalists who are not members of terrorist groups, journalists who report dispassionately about the events on the ground.
Yes, and finally, we've heard a statement from Egypt saying it is working closely with Qatar and the United States to secure a 60-day pause, ceasefire in Gaza. With hostilities escalating and obviously Israel's new announcement that it plans to occupy the whole of Gaza City, what are the chances now of diplomacy moving forward and Hamas being more susceptible to talks with Israel, with the United States, with Egypt and Qatar?
Qatar and Egypt should be commended because they are working very hard in very difficult circumstances to restore a ceasefire. And I believe that the international community should commend both these countries, because the ceasefire is essential to release the hostages. Israel cannot release those hostages by military operations. Hamas planned for this scenario very carefully, and Israeli success of releasing hostages is virtually zero without a ceasefire. But of course, Hamas will also have to disarm and surrender, because it conducted a very brutal terrorist attack that led to this devastating war. So it should be three phases. One is release of hostages. Second is either the relocation of Hamas to another country or their surrender. And of course, disarmament of all groups in Gaza, so that there will be peace in Gaza and in the Middle East.
Professor Rohan Gunaratne, thank you very much for joining us. Pleasure talking to you as always. And here on NewsX World, we will of course bring you all the updates in regards to the ongoing Gaza crisis. We now move on once again and over to the United States, where President Donald Trump says that his tariffs are bringing in trillions into the US economy without driving inflation. In a post on Truth Social, he criticized Goldman Sachs CEO David Solomon for negative outlooks, suggesting he should focus on being a DJ. Latest data shows US consumer prices rose moderately in July, but service costs and some tariff-linked goods saw the biggest underlying inflation jump in 6 months. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt defended the tariffs, saying they were strengthening the economy while safeguarding American jobs.
Look, right now it stands with these two companies. Perhaps it could expand in the future to other companies. I think it's a creative idea and solution. The legality of it, the mechanics of it is still being ironed out by the Department of Commerce, and I would defer you to them for any further details on how it will actually be implemented. But again, this was another idea of the president and his brain trust on his trade team to try to, get good deals for the American people and the American taxpayer.
Earlier, Trump also announced that a 100% tariff on imported semiconductors with exemptions for companies building production in the United States. This decision sparked stock gains for chip makers with US ties. It also follows unique deals with NVIDIA and AMD, where they will pay 15% of their China-sourced chip revenues to the US government in exchange for export licenses. Moreover, markets expect a FED rate cut in September. Economists warn that tariff-related costs could still push inflation higher as previously imported inventory runs out. We're now joined by Dr. Ajay Jua. He's a former Secretary of Commerce and senior economist. He joins us live from New Delhi. Thank you very much, Dr. Jua. First of all, I want to get into Donald Trump's statements. Despite pushback from economists all around the world, Donald Trump maintains praise for his tariff policy. Are tariffs truly bringing in trillions into the US economy, or is that an overstatement? As we've said previously, there has been widespread criticism of this policy when they were first announced in April to this very day. What are your thoughts, Dr. Jua?
Thank you very much. The trade of the United States last year, that for the aggregate for the entire year 2004, was about $4 trillion in the import. Let me put it, the import trade, of which $3 trillion was goods and services, goods, and about $1 trillion services. Now, out of the same level of imports or a slight increase, with more than 50% of the items imported into the US, even now exempted from additional tariff, it leaves about $1.5 trillion of goods coming into the US. And the average tariff which has been imposed so far is about, even if you take it as 15%, 15% into $1.5 trillion comes to an aggregate figure of $225 billion a year, which is about $20 billion a month. So I'm not sure whether President Trump was talking about trillions of dollars of trade or trillions of dollars of tariff income, because by no stretch of imagination, even at 50% tariff rate, which is imposed on a couple of countries, or 3 countries in fact now, it would only double up from 225 to 450. But where the trillions are actually, I think there's a slight mix-up between the volume of imports and the additional revenue.
Yes, indeed, Dr. Jua. If July saw the biggest underlying inflation jump in 6 months for certain goods, can tariffs still be defended as non-inflationary as they have done by the US president?
If those could be called that way, if there was an augmentation because of the tariff, there was an augmentation of supplies. The supply of goods, non-tariff goods, that means the goods which are the exempt category, or more of those are produced within the US, because those are produced there and consumed there. So the inflation can have a positive effect on inflation. But it's to start producing goods in the US, or for that matter anywhere in the world, takes time. You have to settle for producing only those things in which you have an advantage or the ability to produce, what economists refer to as comparative advantage. So I don't think it can ever be said with confidence that inflation will come down if I levy tariff. The tariff is paid by, let's say, not by the exporter. The exporters, it is paid by the importer at the US customs. It is coming from US buyers, and where does the importer collect it? From the customers of those goods. So it is the US customer, US based customer, who is paying for these tariffs. So if he is paying an additional 15% on an average, to that extent, unless backed by higher production, which, as I said, is rather difficult in the short run, the inflation is bound to set in.
Yes, Dr. Jua.
Difference between the Fed governor, the Fed chairman, Mr. Powell, and the US is even on these basic things. When he refused to, even in the last meeting of the Monetary Committee, which sets the interest rates, the Fed chairman was very clear, saying that inflation has now gone up to 2.5 to 2.6%, and with tariffs, and he didn't use the word tariff, but he said trade uncertainty, the potential for it to rise is high. That is why we are not going in for softening of the interest rates. That means pumping in more money into the economy.
Yes, Dr. Jua, do stay with us as we have more US tariff news. US trade officials will hold another meeting with their Chinese counterparts in the next 2 or 3 months to discuss the future of bilateral economic ties. This comes from Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. The remarks come a day after both trading partners agreed to extend their tariff truce for another 90 days, avoiding triple-digit duties on each other's goods. Washington accuses Beijing of not stopping the flow of precursor chemicals used to make fentanyl, a leading cause of overdose deaths in the United States. Beijing defends its drug control record and charges Washington with using fentanyl to blackmail China. President Donald Trump imposed 20% tariffs on Chinese imports over the issue in February, which remain in place despite a fragile trade truce reached in Geneva in May. An additional 10% base tariff has also been levied on Chinese goods. US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said that several major trade agreements, including with Switzerland and India, are still pending, but described both the South Asian nation as a bit recalibrant in its trade talks with Washington. We're now once again joined by Dr. Jua to discuss these statements further. How sustainable is this 90-day tariff truce given the unresolved disputes over fentanyl and, of course, broader trade imbalances too, Dr. Jua?
I think with China, for obvious reasons, the US has to be patient. The US is not going to be able to dictate deadlines to them. They are in a position, as they have already demonstrated, of hitting back without calling it tit for tat. They can also hurt the US, as they have shown in the case of the rare earths and the magnets, as well as in terms of certain other technology flows, the backward flows from the US, from China to the US, by putting restrictions on that. So with China, given its vulnerability to the Chinese exports to the US, as well as the Chinese imports, the US will have to go along with it very patiently. And the Chinese have already mentioned it at no uncertain terms, that we are not going to be adhering to the deadlines for negotiations or arriving at deals dictated by the US. We will take our own time, and it's like a take it or leave it kind of an offer. And I think given the mutual dependence upon each other, the U.S. has done well by agreeing to, but at the last moment, again, the Chinese would have noticed that on the 7th night or on the 8th night when the, why 8th night? That was the day before, on the 11th.
Yes.
On the 11th night, when the deal with China was expiring, the last 90 days extension, that was at the nick of the moment, the government of U.S., the U.S. administration extended it by 3 months. Chinese would have liked to have it, greater predictability and greater certainty. So I'm sure that with China, the behavior, the conduct of the U.S. president,
Yes, Dr. Jua.
then it's going to be with the rest of the world, which is probably vulnerable and in not such a good position to challenge the U.S. like a trade.
Yes, Dr. Jua, thank you very much for joining us here on NewsX World. Pleasure to have you on the programme. However, that is all that we have time for, and we will continue to bring you more news updates from around the world. Thank you for joining us.